You know that weird sense of panic when you leave your kids alone for just a minute, and you come back to chaos? Well, try this on for size. I went inside for literally 2 minutes, just enough time to pee and wash my hands. And when I came back out, there was a grown woman-me neighbor, mind you, leaning over the fence, screaming at my kids in our backyard pool, like she was some kind of mall cop lifeguard. At first I thought maybe something serious had happened, maybe they were in danger or something. But nope. Turns out, she just didn't like the way my kids saw and decided they didn't belong in her neighborhood, even though we'd lived there longer than she had. She was yelling things like, "Saw, get out of the pool. This isn't your place." Saw, and trying to drag my kids out of the water like she was saving them from a burning building. Except, this wasn't heroic, it was racist, entitled, and absolutely unhinged. My two kids, Liam and Zoe, were just laughing, wearing floaties, tossing a beach ball between them, while this lady, let's call her Deborah, was full-on losing her mind because apparently in her fantasy version of the world, my backyard somehow belonged to Saw. Now, I should probably back up for a second and paint you the picture. We'd moved into Willowdale Heights about 3 years ago. It's one of those suburban neighborhoods where everyone acts like they're in a perpetual HOA meeting, even though, thankfully, we don't have an HOA. Deborah moved in just last year, 2 doors down. Single, no kids, perfectly trimmed hedges, always jogging in matching outfits like she's starring in some fitness commercial from 2004. We didn't have issues at first. She mostly ignored us until the day we set up the pool. It wasn't anything crazy, just a decent above-ground pool, set up in the yard so our kids could enjoy their summer. We filled it up, tossed in a couple of noodles, got one of those flamingo floaties that Zoe begged for. And for the most part, things were great. That Saturday was warm, a perfect summer kickoff. The kids had just finished school for the year and were bouncing off the walls with energy. So we did what any parent would do, threw them in the pool, super VY set of course, and let them burn it off. And like I said, he stepped inside for 2 minutes. But that's all it took. When I came back out, Deborah was inside our yard, yelling at my kids like she was breaking up a drug ring or something. "We don't need your kind in this neighborhood," she screamed, and that's when my stomach dropped. Not because I didn't expect her to be rude, I'd seen her cut glances before, act cold, passive-aggressive, but this was something else. Something mean. Something ugly. I ran over, instantly in mama bear mode, and shouted, "What in the Saw world, Saw, are you doing?" Deborah didn't miss a beat. "I'm calling the police," she snapped. "These kids are trespassing." I blinked. In my Saw backyard. "They don't belong here," she said. "They don't look like they're from around here." Let me tell you, it's one thing to hear casual bigotry in passing. It's another thing entirely to see a woman try to yank your wet, shivering 7-year-old out of a pool while calling 911 and telling the dispatcher that your children are criminals. She stood there, phone to her ear, saying things like, "Saw, yes, I need an officer immediately. There are intruders in my neighborhood. They're using my pool, Saw. My pool." She said it like she owned the block. Meanwhile, my kids were staring at me with wide eyes, confused and scared. I got down on one knee beside Liam and told him gently, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's got this." I turned to Deborah and said, "You need to leave right now." But she just laughed and kept shouting into the phone. "They're threatening me now," she added. "The mother's getting aggressive." I wanted to scream, but I knew I had to keep my head. You can't go nuclear when someone's actively trying to weaponize the police against your family. I just stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. Minutes later, I heard the sirens. Now, I'll be honest, I was scared. Not of the police per se, but of how easily things can go sideways in these situations, especially when someone like Deborah is trying to spin a story before you've even had a chance to speak. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. One was older, with that tired, "I've seen too much of this" look. The other was younger, a little more wide-eyed, taking notes. They walked up cautiously. The older one asked, "Ma'am, we received a report about kids trespassing in a pool. I raised my hand. That's my pool. These are my kids. I pointed at Deborah, broke into saw my saw yard, screamed at my children, and is now lying to you. The officers turned to Deborah, who was standing by the fence, arms crossed, still muttering about how these people don't belong here. Ma'am, one of the officers asked, are you saying this is your yard? Deborah scoffed. No, but I live nearby, and I've never seen those children before. I just assumed. Ma'am, he interrupted, assuming isn't grounds for a 911 call. She looked taken aback. They look suspicious. They're wearing floaties, I shot back. What exactly do you find suspicious about a 7-year-old in Spider-Man trunks? The older officer sighed and rubbed his temples like he had a migraine forming. Ma'am, are you aware that entering someone's property without permission is trespassing? Deborah's face went pale. She stuttered. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. By breaking into someone else's yard and trying to remove their children from their own pool, he asked flatly. At that point, even the younger cop raised an eyebrow. Do you have any proof that these children don't live here? No, but then you may have made a false report, he said. And that is a crime. I kid you not, the moment they started to turn the focus back onto her, Deborah's entire demeanor changed. She went from defiant to defensive in 0.2 seconds. You can't treat me like this, she spat. I'm calling my lawyer. Go ahead, the officer said. I'm sure they'd love to hear about how you tried to evict 2 kids from their own backyard. Deborah turned to leave, but then, in one final, dramatic meltdown, she shouted, You don't know who you're messing with. You'll regret this. One of the officers said dryly, Ma'am, please turn around. We need to have a conversation back at the station. And yep, you guessed it, he cuffed her right there on my lawn. The kids were still clutching their pool noodles, watching with wide eyes as Deborah was walked out of the yard and into the cruiser. Zoe whispered, Mom, did she just get arrested? Yep, I said. And that's what happens when you call the cops on someone for no good reason. Later that week, Deborah tried to spin her side of the story. She called an emergency town meeting at the community rec center and showed up with a stack of printed out complaints that nobody asked for. I went, mostly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to make sure she didn't get away with spinning some wild narrative. She started rambling about outsiders and neighborhood safety, but you could tell she was losing the room. One by one, neighbors started speaking up. People I barely knew were like, Actually, I saw the whole thing. That lady's kids were playing in their own pool. Deborah lost it. Another neighbor added, You know, she accused my teenage nephew of stealing her mail last month. He was literally just skateboarding. Someone else, she called code enforcement on my garden gnome because she said it was too provocative. By the time I spoke, the room was already firmly against her. I calmly explained everything that had happened, the trespassing, the yelling, the 911 call, and the moment I got to the part where she said saw, they don't look like they belong. Saw a hush fell over the room. That was it. That was the moment people saw it for what it really was, not a misunderstanding, not neighborhood concern, but flat-out racism. And to be honest, I didn't even have to add much after that. Deborah tried to interrupt a few times, but no one was listening anymore. Her reputation was toast. After that meeting, we started forming a little coalition of sorts, neighbors who wanted to look out for each other, make sure no one else went through what we did. We talked about setting up a community watch, but not the paranoid, walkie-talkie kind. More like, Saw, hey, you're welcome here. We've got your back, Saw kind of energy. Deborah? Well, she's still around. Still jogging. Still trimming her hedges like it's an Olympic sport. But now she keeps her distance. I think the whole being publicly arrested for calling the cops on 2 kids in floaties thing did some real damage to her pride. A few weeks later, I saw her peeking over the fence again while the kids were playing. This time, I smiled and said, Hey Deborah, want to come join the pool party? She blinked. Like, actually blinked. Then she huffed and turned away. Liam looked at me and said, She's weird. I nodded. Yeah, but now she knows. This is our neighborhood too. So hey, if you've ever had to deal with a Deborah of your own, let me know in the comments. What would Saw You Saw have done in my shoes? Do you think the cops handled it right? Do people like her ever learn? Let's talk about it. Because the more we share these stories, the less power people like that have to define what belongs.